The fence is fully approved. You'll find the permits are all in order.
When I pulled into my driveway after 10 days away, the first thing I noticed was not the porch light, the mail stacked against my door, or the suitcase still sitting in my passenger seat. It was the silence from my backyard. The side gate was hanging crooked, the soil near it was scraped raw, and beyond the corner of my garage, where my old cedar fence should have been, there was a brand new line of wooden panels sitting almost 8 feet inside my property. At first, my mind refused to accept what I was seeing. The vegetable beds I had spent 2 springs building were gone. The little maple tree my mother had helped me plant after I bought the house had been cut down to a pale stump. My stepping stones were stacked in a dirty pile like trash. And on the land that had been my backyard when I left town, my neighbor Bradley Turner had already set up a patio, outdoor chairs, and a black metal fire pit, as if the ground had always belonged to him. I had been gone because my mother was recovering from surgery. While I was sleeping in a hospital recliner 3 states away, somebody had moved the boundary of my life with a post-hole digger and a truckload of confidence. Bradley came out before I even knocked. He did not look surprised. He did not look guilty. He looked like a man waiting to enjoy the moment. He told me the fence had finally been corrected, that the HOA had approved the new alignment, and that I should be grateful because the yard looked cleaner now. When I said he had taken my land, he smiled like I had told a joke and reminded me that the fence was already moved, so the burden was on me to prove otherwise. By sunset, the HOA president had sent me a violation notice for interfering with an approved fence correction, $750. I had lost part of my yard, my garden, my tree, and somehow I was the one being punished. 3 weeks later, a county surveyor would stand in that same backyard with orange boundary stakes in his hand, while Bradley's face went white. The HOA president would stop talking in front of the entire board, and the patio Bradley built in secret would become the most expensive mistake he ever made. But in that first moment, standing beside my crooked gate, I had only one thing Bradley did not know about. I still had the original survey from the day I bought the house. That survey had been sitting in a blue folder in the bottom drawer of my desk since the week I closed on the house. Most people probably would have forgotten about it. I almost did too, but I had paid for it back then because this house was not some investment property to me. It was the first place I had ever owned on my own, the first front door where my name was on the deed, and the first backyard where I felt like I could finally breathe without asking anybody's permission. The house was not huge. It was a 1-story place in a quiet subdivision outside town, with a narrow driveway, an old maple near the curb, and a backyard that backed up to a shallow drainage strip behind the lots. The siding needed paint when I bought it. The kitchen cabinets were dated. The back fence leaned a little in one corner. But after years of renting apartments where every wall, parking space, and pet rule belonged to somebody else, that little house felt like freedom. My mother had walked through it with me before I made the offer. She noticed the backyard before anything else. She said it had good morning light, the kind of light her father used to look for before planting tomatoes. So the first spring after I moved in, she came over with seedlings, gloves, and a stubborn belief that any bare patch of dirt could become something beautiful. We built 2 raised garden beds together. We planted herbs along the fence, and near the back corner, we planted a young maple tree because she said every home needed something that would grow older with you. That was why seeing that stump hurt more than Bradley could have understood. He did not just take a strip of grass. He erased hours of work, small memories, and the one peaceful corner of my life that had never bothered anybody. Before Bradley Turner moved in next door, the neighborhood had been quiet in the usual HOA way. People waved, complained about mailbox colors, and argued politely over trash cans being left out too long. I kept to myself. I paid my dues on time. I followed the rules even when they were annoying. I was not the kind of homeowner who wanted a war with a neighbor, and I definitely was not looking for a fight with the HOA board. Bradley arrived about a year after me, and from the beginning he acted less like a neighbor and more like a man inspecting property he intended to control. He had a loud truck, expensive patio furniture, and a habit of reminding everyone that he used to work around real estate deals. He liked saying he knew how communities like ours really operated. He knew the board. He knew the process. He knew which rules mattered and which ones could be worked around. At first, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. When he made little comments about my backyard being underused, I laughed it off. When he said my fence line made his yard look smaller from his kitchen window, I changed the subject. When he suggested that a few feet of land behind my fence would not make much difference to me, but would make his patio layout perfect, I told him politely that I was not interested. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the complaints started. One week the HOA sent me a notice about weeds near the back fence, even though the grass had been trimmed. Then there was a warning about garden materials being visible from a neighboring property. Then a note about my fence needing aesthetic review, even though it had been there long before either Bradley or I owned our homes. Each notice felt small enough to ignore on its own, but together they formed a pattern I did not like. Still, I stayed calm. I took photos, answered emails, and kept copies of everything. I had watched enough ordinary people get bullied by paperwork to know that sometimes the person who looks quiet is only quiet because they are paying attention. And if you have ever had an HOA, neighbor, or property manager act like your silence means weakness, share your thoughts in the comments, because people need to understand how easily a small boundary issue can turn into a fight for your own land. A few days before I left to help my mother through surgery, Bradley stopped near the fence while I was carrying groceries inside. He looked over my yard like he was measuring it in his head. Then he said something strange, something I should have taken more seriously at the time. He said that when I came back, maybe my backyard would finally make sense. I thought he was being arrogant. I did not realize he was giving me a warning. By the time I understood what Bradley's warning meant, the damage had already been done. I had left town before sunrise on a Tuesday, locking the back gate behind me with the tired focus of someone thinking only about hospital rooms, medication schedules, and whether my mother would be scared when she woke up from surgery. I checked the front door twice, set the thermostat, and glanced once at the backyard before I drove away. The fence was still where it had always been. The garden beds were still full. The young maple was still standing in the corner, thin but healthy, with leaves that had just started to turn. 10 days later, I came home to a different property. The first few seconds were confusing because nothing at the front of the house looked unusual. My trash bins were in place. The porch looked untouched. Even the HOA flag at the entrance of the subdivision was still fluttering in that polished, harmless way that made the neighborhood look peaceful from the street. But the moment I opened the side gate, my stomach dropped so hard I had to grip the latch. The fence line had been moved, not repaired, not adjusted, moved. The old cedar panels were gone from the back edge of my yard, and a newer, straighter fence now cut across my property like someone had drawn a new border while I was away. It stole nearly 8 feet from the rear of my lot, stretching from one side to the other with fresh post holes, raw dirt, and construction dust still visible along the base. Where my raised vegetable beds had been, the ground was scraped flat. The tomato cages were bent and tossed near my garage. The herbs my mother had planted were buried under muddy tire tracks. The little maple tree was nothing but a stump surrounded by pale wood chips. Beyond the new fence, on the land that had been mine when I left, Bradley had already arranged his victory. A half-finished patio sat over the flattened soil, with gray pavers laid in a tight pattern, outdoor chairs positioned toward the sunset, and a black fire pit placed almost exactly where my garden bench used to be. It did not look like a mistake. It looked staged. It looked like he wanted me to see how completely he had taken control before I could stop him. Then I noticed the camera cable. The small security camera I kept under the back eave had gone offline while I was away. At first, I had assumed it was a Wi-Fi issue. Now I could see the wire dangling near the siding, cut cleanly enough that weather could not explain it. The camera had not failed. Someone had made sure it would not record the work being done behind my house. I walked to Bradley's front door with dirt still on my shoes and my pulse pounding in my ears. Before I even reached his porch, he came outside as if he had been watching for me. His expression told me everything. He was not nervous. He was not embarrassed. He was pleased. He explained, in the smooth voice of a man who had practiced his version of the story, that the old fence had been out of alignment, that the HOA Architectural Committee had approved a correction, and that the neighborhood was finally getting a cleaner property line. He treated my garden like clutter and my tree like an inconvenience. He acted as if the land behind my house had been sitting in the wrong place all along, and he had simply fixed it. When I told him that he had moved a fence onto my property, he did not deny moving it. He only leaned on the word property as if it amused him. He said the HOA had signed off, the fence was already installed, and if I believed something was wrong, I would have to prove it through the proper channels. Then he warned me that if I crossed the new fence or touched anything on the patio side, he would call the sheriff and report me for trespassing and vandalism. That was the moment the situation stopped feeling like a neighbor dispute and started feeling like a trap. Within an hour, the HOA president, Marilyn Cole, arrived in her white SUV with a folder under one arm and that stiff board member smile people use when they have already chosen a side. She did not ask to see my deed. She did not ask where the old fence had been. She did not ask why my camera wire was cut or why my tree had been removed while I was out of state. She simply told me that Bradley had submitted a fence alignment improvement request, that the committee had approved it, and that continued interference could be considered a violation of community standards. I kept asking how the HOA could approve a fence movement that changed the use of my land. Marilyn kept repeating that the board handled exterior consistency and that homeowners were expected to cooperate with approved corrections. Her words sounded official, but there was nothing behind them except confidence. No survey, no county map, no written permission from me. Just Bradley's application, an HOA stamp, and an assumption that I would be too overwhelmed to challenge it. The next morning, the violation notice appeared in my email. The subject line made my hands go cold before I even opened it. According to the HOA, I had refused to comply with an approved fence correction, created a hostile interaction with a neighboring homeowner, and disrupted authorized landscaping work. The fine was $750, with additional penalties possible if I continued to contest the corrected boundary. I read it 3 times because my brain could not process the insult of it. My land had been taken, my garden had been destroyed, my mother's maple tree had been cut down, my security camera had been disabled, and somehow the official record being created by the HOA made me look like the problem. For one long minute I wanted to march back over there and tear every board out of the ground with my own hands. I wanted Bradley to feel the same panic he had left for me. But then I looked behind my garage and saw a pile of old cedar posts he had not hauled away yet. One of them still had a strip of weathered orange survey tape tied around the base, half buried under dirt, exactly where the original corner line had once been marked. That tiny piece of tape changed everything. Bradley thought he had erased the evidence while I was gone. He had only shown me where to start looking. I did not touch the fence that night. I did not step across the new line, even though every instinct in me wanted to walk straight onto the stolen part of my yard and pull my broken garden tools out of the dirt. Bradley wanted a reaction. The HOA wanted a record that made me look unstable. So I gave them the one thing they were not expecting. I got quiet. I started with my phone. I photographed everything from every angle I could reach without crossing the new fence. The fresh post holes, the dirt line where the old fence had stood, the stump of my maple tree, the destroyed garden beds, the tire marks, the severed camera cable, the stacked stones, the new pavers, the fire pit, and the pile of old cedar posts behind my garage. I took close-up photos of the orange survey tape still tied to one of the old posts. Then I recorded a slow video from the side gate to the back corner, describing what had been there before I left and what had changed while I was gone. After that, I opened the blue folder from my desk. Inside were the closing papers from when I bought the house, the title documents, the plat reference, and the private survey I had paid for before signing. I spread everything across my kitchen table under the same light where my mother and I used to sort seed packets in the spring. The survey showed my rear property line clearly. It also showed the old fence running close to that line, with a narrow drainage easement behind the lots. The fence Bradley had installed was not a correction. It was a seizure. I measured the scale on the survey, then compared it with what I could see in the yard. The new fence appeared to be nearly 8 feet inside my lot for most of the width of the backyard. That meant Bradley had not taken a corner or a confusing sliver of grass. He had taken a long strip of usable land, enough for a patio, enough for a fire pit, enough to permanently change the shape and value of my property if I let it stand. The next morning, I sent the HOA a calm email. I did not accuse anyone of fraud. I did not threaten lawsuits. I asked for the complete architectural application, the approval letter, any survey Bradley submitted, any county permit connected to the work, and any rule that allowed the HOA to approve a fence relocation affecting a neighboring deeded lot. I copied myself on everything and saved the message as a PDF. Their response came back shorter than I expected. They attached a 1-page approval form for a fence alignment improvement. There was no survey, no permit, no notice to me, no signed acknowledgement from any affected property owner. Bradley had written that the work was entirely within his lot and improved neighborhood consistency. The committee had approved it based on that statement. That was the first crack. I called the county clerk's office and requested the recorded plat map for my subdivision. Then I searched the online permit database using Bradley's address. There was nothing for a patio, nothing for a fixed fire pit, nothing for electrical work, nothing for fence relocation, and nothing that mentioned work near the drainage easement. I took screenshots of each search result and saved them in a folder labeled with the date. Then I called a licensed surveyor. When I explained that a neighbor had moved a fence while I was out of town, the woman at the front desk became very quiet. She asked whether I had a prior survey, whether the HOA had issued approval, and whether construction had already happened. By the time I finished, she told me they had a crew available later that week, and that I should not move, remove, or repair anything before they came. The existing mess, as ugly as it was, had become evidence. While I waited for the survey crew, I pulled footage from my front camera. The backyard camera had gone dead on the second morning after I left, but the front camera had kept recording. It showed a contractor's truck arriving at Bradley's house just after sunrise. It showed workers carrying fence panels along the side of his property. It showed Bradley standing in the driveway with folded arms while the old cedar sections were loaded onto a trailer. On the second day, the same truck returned with pavers. The camera could not see my backyard directly, but it did not need to. It established timing, vehicles, workers, and Bradley's presence. It also showed that the work happened while I was out of state, not during some mutual fence project as Bradley had tried to imply. Then I searched my old emails. 3 months before this happened, Bradley had sent me a message asking whether I would consider selling him the narrow strip behind my fence because it would make his patio layout easier. I had forgotten about it because I had answered politely and moved on. Now that email felt like a confession. He had known the strip existed, he had known it was connected to my property, and when I refused to sell it, he found another way to take it. By the end of the week, my kitchen table looked like a case file. Printed emails, HOA notices, photos, camera stills, county screenshots, the old survey, the new violation letter, the first estimate for replacing the tree, A note from my security company confirming that the camera cable had been physically cut, not damaged by weather. The survey crew arrived on a gray morning with tripods, flags, and GPS equipment. Bradley watched from his patio like a man pretending not to be nervous. Marilyn from the HOA drove by twice and slowed down both times. I stayed on my side of the yard and let the professionals work. For almost an hour, they measured without saying much. They checked markers, compared records, and placed temporary flags in the ground. Then the lead surveyor walked over to me with a face that told me the answer before he said anything. He explained that the new fence was well inside my property, that the patio and fire pit appeared to cross the deeded boundary, and that part of the work might also interfere with the county drainage easement. He did not tell me to argue with Bradley. He told me to call an attorney before anyone moved another board. The attorney I called did not sound impressed by Bradley's confidence or the HOA's approval stamp. She asked for the survey, the HOA notice, the photos, the permit search results, and every message Bradley had ever sent me about the backyard. Then she told me something that changed the way I looked at the entire situation. A fence did not become a legal boundary just because someone moved it. An HOA approval did not transfer deeded land, and a neighbor could not create ownership by destroying the evidence while the actual owner was out of town. 2 days later, the surveyor sent the official report. I opened the PDF at my kitchen table and stared at the red overlay until my hands stopped shaking. The new fence was not slightly off. It was not a misunderstanding caused by an old subdivision map or a crooked line of cedar posts. It sat 7.8 feet inside my property at the widest point, and remained inside my deeded boundary for almost the entire rear width of the lot. Bradley's patio, his pavers, his chairs, and the fire pit he had placed like a trophy were sitting on land that the county records showed belonged to me. But that was only the first problem. The survey also confirmed something I had barely understood when I bought the house. Behind our lots ran an old county drainage easement, a narrow strip reserved for stormwater access and maintenance. It did not belong to Bradley, and it did not belong entirely to me, in the sense that I could build whatever I wanted on it. The county had rights there, and any permanent structure near that area had to follow setback and drainage rules. Bradley had not just taken my backyard, he had built over and beside a protected drainage area without a permit, without county review, and without the legal right to touch the ground he was improving. That was when the story stopped being his word against mine. My attorney prepared a demand letter that was calm, detailed, and brutal in a way shouting could never be. It identified the encroachment, referenced the recorded plat, attached the survey, and demanded that Bradley stop all use of the disputed area immediately. It required him to preserve all communications with his contractor and the HOA, remove no evidence without written agreement, restore the property line, compensate me for the destroyed garden beds, the maple tree, the camera damage, the survey costs, and the first round of legal fees. It also put the HOA on notice that its approval appeared to have been issued without authority, without a survey, and without notice to the affected property owner. Bradley's response was exactly the kind of mistake people make when they have been winning too long. Instead of calling a lawyer, he sent an email mocking the letter. He claimed my attorney was trying to scare him, that the HOA had already decided the fence was correct, and that he had no intention of moving anything unless a judge forced him to. He also wrote that he had spent too much money improving that strip to let me ruin it out of spite. That single phrase, that strip, mattered more than he realized. It showed he knew it was a separate strip of land, not simply his existing backyard. Combined with the email from 3 months earlier, where he had asked to buy the same narrow area behind my fence, it made his position look less like confusion and more like intent. Then Marilyn made the HOA's situation worse. My attorney asked the board to produce the documents supporting their approval. Marilyn replied through the HOA management email that the association did not need county permission for fence corrections inside the community and that homeowners were expected to accept architectural decisions once approved. She treated the HOA rules like they were stronger than deeds, stronger than county records, and stronger than property law. My attorney forwarded that response back to me with a note that said it should be saved in multiple places. I saved everything: the official survey, the red overlay, the plat map, the county drainage easement, the empty permit search, the HOA approval form with no survey attached, the violation notice fining me for objecting, Bradley's old offer to buy the land, Bradley's new email admitting he had improved the strip, Marilyn's claim that HOA approval was enough. Then one more piece fell into place. Mr. Alvarez, the retired man who lived 2 houses down, knocked on my door one afternoon with an uncomfortable look on his face. He had seen the work happen while I was gone. He had watched Bradley speak with the contractor near the old fence line. He had not wanted to get involved because neighborhood fights had a way of spreading. But after he saw the HOA fine me for the damage done to my own yard, he said he could not stay silent. He wrote a signed statement explaining that he heard Bradley tell the workers to move it while I was away, because I would not fight it once it was done. That statement hit harder than any insult Bradley had thrown at me. Until then, I had suspected he planned it. Now I had someone willing to put it in writing. My attorney sent the packet to code enforcement and copied the county office responsible for drainage easements. She also sent a second notice to the HOA, demanding that they suspend the fine, preserve all architectural committee records, and disclose whether Marilyn or anyone on the board had communicated privately with Bradley before the approval was issued. For the first time since I came home, the pressure shifted away from me. Bradley stopped walking around the patio with his drink in his hand. Marilyn stopped sending short, confident emails. The HOA management company suddenly began using careful language about reviewing the matter. The same people who had acted like the fence was already settled were now asking for time, documents, clarification, and meetings. They had spent 2 weeks treating my property line like an opinion. Now the county map had turned it into a fact. When the next HOA meeting came around, Marilyn expected me to show up alone, embarrassed, and ready to beg for the $750 fine to be removed. Instead, I walked in with my attorney, the surveyor's report, a folder full of exhibits, and a notice from code enforcement confirming that an inspector had been assigned to Bradley's unpermitted patio. That was the night Bradley finally understood the difference between moving a fence and moving a boundary. The inspector arrived 2 mornings later in a county truck that made Bradley come outside before the engine was even turned off. He walked out fast, trying to look casual, but there was no confidence in the way he kept glancing at the patio, the new fence, and then back toward my house. For weeks, he had controlled the story with attitude. Now the story had a case number. The code enforcement inspector did not care who was popular in the neighborhood. He did not care that Marilyn had approved an architectural request, or that Bradley kept saying the fence had already been corrected. He asked for permits. Bradley had none. He asked for the survey used before construction. Bradley did not have one. He asked who authorized work near the drainage easement. Bradley pointed toward the HOA, and for the first time, Marilyn was not standing close enough to be useful. The inspector walked the property with the surveyor's report in one hand and the county plat in the other. He looked at the fire pit, the paver base, the fresh fence posts, and the drainage strip behind the lots. Then he placed a red notice on Bradley's patio door, stating that the structure and related work were under review for unpermitted construction and possible easement obstruction. It was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was official. Bradley tried to argue that it was just a backyard patio. The inspector told him that once construction crossed a recorded boundary and touched an easement area, it stopped being a neighbor preference and became a compliance issue. He also told Bradley not to remove, cover, or alter anything until the county finished its review. The patio Bradley had built to prove he could take my land was now frozen in place as evidence against him. Later that afternoon, the county surveyor came out with marking flags and orange stakes. Several neighbors had started watching from porches and windows. Bradley stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Marilyn arrived with 2 HOA board members and a folder she never opened. My attorney stood beside me, calm enough to make everyone else look nervous. The surveyor did not give a speech. He simply measured, checked the recorded markers, and began placing stakes where the legal boundary actually ran. One by one, the orange stakes appeared behind Bradley's new fence, cutting straight through the area he had been calling his patio. The fire pit sat on the wrong side. The chairs sat on the wrong side. The fence itself sat on the wrong side. There was no clever explanation left for him to hide behind. Bradley muttered that the old fence had always been confusing. My attorney opened the folder and showed him his own email from 3 months earlier, the one where he asked to buy the narrow strip behind my fence. After that, he stopped talking. A sheriff's deputy arrived not long after, not because anyone was being arrested, but because Bradley had previously threatened to use law enforcement to keep me off my own land. The deputy reviewed the survey, the demand letter, and the code enforcement notice. Then he told Bradley plainly that he could not use a trespass complaint to remove a deeded owner from land the current survey identified as theirs. The words were calm, but they landed hard. The threat Bradley had waved over me for weeks had just been taken out of his hands. The HOA meeting that evening felt completely different from every meeting I had attended before. Marilyn still sat at the front table, but the room no longer belonged to her. Residents had heard about the county visit. They had seen the orange stakes. They had watched the red notice go up. For the first time, people were not whispering about whether I was making trouble. They were asking why the board had approved work that affected a property line without requiring a survey. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult Bradley. I laid out the documents in order. The original survey, the new survey, the plat map, Bradley's email asking to buy the land, the HOA approval form with no supporting survey, the violation notice fining me, the statement from Mr. Alvarez, the permit search results, and the code enforcement notice. Each page made the room quieter. Marilyn tried to call it a misunderstanding. My attorney responded that misunderstandings do not cut camera wires, remove trees, pour pavers over another owner's land, or generate fines against the person whose property was taken. Then she placed an invoice summary on the table and said the sentence that made Marilyn finally look down. "Your misunderstanding has a dollar amount." From that moment on, nobody in that room treated my backyard like a matter of opinion. It was a boundary. It was recorded. It was verified, and now it had witnesses. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They came in letters, invoices, inspection reports, board notices, and the slow collapse of every confident thing Bradley had said since the day I came home. Code enforcement ordered the fire pit, paver base, and patio features removed from the easement area and from my side of the property line. Bradley had to hire a different contractor to undo the work he had rushed through while I was out of state. The original contractor received a licensing complaint for performing property line work without verifying ownership or requiring a survey, and according to the county record, the patio violation stayed attached to Bradley's address until the site was inspected and cleared. The HOA canceled the $750 fine without another argument. Then, after my attorney pushed for the architectural committee records, the board admitted in writing that the approval had been issued based only on Bradley's statement that the work affected his lot. No survey had been reviewed. No neighbor notice had been sent. No county easement check had been done. Marilyn tried to call it a procedural mistake, but the residents did not accept that. At the next special meeting, she lost her position as HOA president. Bradley paid for the survey cost, the first legal fees, the camera repair, the replacement of my garden beds, and the replanting of a young maple in the same corner where the old one had stood. He also had to pay to rebuild the fence along the verified boundary, this time with the orange stakes still visible while the posts went in. I did not need to stand over anyone or say anything clever. The property line did all the talking. The strange part was how quiet the neighborhood became afterward. People who had once looked away started waving again. The board stopped sending vague violation notices. Bradley stopped hosting backyard gatherings for a long time. And every time I looked through my kitchen window, I saw the new fence exactly where the survey said it belonged. My backyard was not perfect after that. The soil had to recover. The garden had to be rebuilt. The new maple was smaller than the one my mother planted with me. But the space was mine again, and that mattered more than making it look untouched. I learned something I wish every homeowner understood before they need it. A calm person with documents is harder to intimidate than an angry person with nothing. Bradley thought moving a fence would move the truth. The HOA thought a stamped approval could replace a deed. But property lines are not decided by confidence, threats, or board politics. They are decided by records, surveys, permits, and evidence. So if an HOA, a neighbor, or anyone else ever tries to make you feel powerless on your own land, do not start by shouting. Start by saving everything. And if this story made you think of a boundary dispute, a bad HOA notice, or a neighbor who pushed too far, leave your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who owns a home, and subscribe for more stories where patience, paperwork, and the law make bullies pay for crossing the line.